"You're like a shadow, neither alive nor needed," he would say. I never argued back, until I saw his son climbing onto the third-floor railing. I jumped, grabbed him, and broke my arm. Growing up, I was the mistake. Not literally, but that's how it felt every single day of my childhood. My brother was 3 years older, and from the moment he could walk, he was everything I wasn't. Athletic, charismatic, the kind of kid who made friends effortlessly and brought home report cards that got hung on the refrigerator with pride. I was the one who sat in the corner during family gatherings, watching everyone else laugh at his jokes and celebrate his achievements. The pattern started early. When he scored the winning goal in his high school soccer championship, the whole family drove 2 hours to watch him play. When I made it to the regional science fair, my parents said they were too busy with work. When he got accepted to his dream college, we had a party. When I got my acceptance letter, my mom just nodded and said, "That's nice, honey," while she was making dinner. It wasn't that they didn't love me. I think they did, in their own way. But love and attention aren't always the same thing, and I learned that lesson young. I became the background character in my own family story, always there but never quite seen. I got used to being overlooked, to having my achievements dismissed as expected rather than celebrated. I learned to make myself small, to not take up space, to not demand anything from anyone. My brother never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place. He had this way of making comments that cut deep but were delivered with just enough casual cruelty that calling him out would make me look overly sensitive. He'd introduce me to his friends as his weird little brother, emphasize the weird part with a laugh that everyone else would join in on. He'd tell me I was lucky to have him as a brother because otherwise nobody would even notice I existed. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I was quiet, awkward, never quite fitting in anywhere. I spent most of my teenage years reading books and avoiding social situations. While he was out partying and dating, I was at home on Friday nights, and our parents would make these little comments about how different we were, how they worried about me not being more social like him. College was supposed to be my escape, but even there, his shadow followed me. We ended up at the same university, and somehow his reputation preceded me everywhere I went. People would find out we were related and immediately start comparing us. He was the guy everyone wanted to be around, and I was just the weird brother who tagged along sometimes. After graduation, things got even worse. He landed this amazing job right out of college, moved into a nice apartment, started dating this incredible woman who seemed to genuinely adore him. Meanwhile, I struggled to find my footing, bouncing between different jobs and living situations, never quite feeling like I belonged anywhere. The family dynamic shifted but stayed fundamentally the same. Holiday gatherings became showcases for his success. He'd arrive with expensive wine and stories about his latest promotion or vacation. I'd show up with a grocery store dessert and sit quietly while everyone asked him questions about his life. When they remembered to include me in conversations, it was always with this tone of gentle concern, like I was a charity case they were obligated to check on. He got married in this beautiful ceremony that felt like a movie. I was his best man, which should have been an honor, but it felt more like another obligation. Standing up there next to him, watching him marry this amazing woman while our entire extended family beamed with pride, I felt more invisible than ever. In his wedding speech, he thanked everyone who had supported him along the way, and somehow managed to mention our parents, his college friends, even his high school soccer coach, but never said my name. When his son was born 2 years later, something in me hoped things might change. I thought maybe becoming an uncle would give me a role in the family that mattered. But even that got complicated. He was fiercely protective of his child, and I could sense his reluctance to let me be too involved. When I offered to babysit, he'd always have some reason why it wasn't necessary. When I bought toys or clothes for the baby, he'd thank me politely, but I'd notice they'd disappear after a while, replaced by newer, better versions. The kid was incredible, though. Bright and curious and fearless in the way that only small children can be. He had his father's confidence, but without the cruelty. When he started walking and talking, he'd run up to me at family gatherings with this pure joy that made my heart ache. He didn't see me as the family disappointment. To him, I was just his uncle who would get down on the floor and play with him when the adults were busy talking. But even those moments were tainted by my brother's constant commentary. He'd make jokes about how I was better with kids than adults, implying that my maturity level matched a toddler's. He'd swoop in whenever his son and I were having fun together, redirecting the child's attention with some more exciting activity or toy. It was like he couldn't stand the idea of his son genuinely enjoying my company. The breaking point came during a family barbecue last summer. We were all gathered at our parents' house, and the kid, who was 3 by then, kept following me around the yard. He wanted me to push him on the swing set, to help him catch fireflies, to read him the same book over and over again. I was having more fun than I'd had in years, just being present with this little person who actually wanted my attention. My brother had been drinking, and I could see him getting more irritated as the afternoon went on. Finally, he pulled me aside and told me I was being too much, that I needed to back off and let other people spend time with his son. The way he said it, with this mix of annoyance and pity, made it clear he thought I was pathetic for being so desperate for a 3-year-old's approval. That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Really cried, the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from a place of profound loneliness. I realized that even in my own family, I was tolerated rather than wanted. I was the obligation, the afterthought, the person they included because they had to, not because they wanted to. I started pulling back after that. I stopped going to every family gathering, stopped trying so hard to be part of conversations, stopped offering help that wasn't wanted. If I was going to be invisible anyway, I figured I might as well embrace it. I threw myself into work, started taking up hobbies that kept me busy on weekends, began building a life that didn't revolve around seeking approval from people who would never give it. The change didn't go unnoticed, but it was received exactly as I expected. My parents would call occasionally to check if I was okay, but they seemed relieved that I wasn't as needy for their attention. My brother actually seemed happier without me around as much. He could be the star of every family gathering without having to worry about including his awkward little brother in the festivities. For a while, this new dynamic felt like a relief. There's something freeing about giving up on expectations that were never going to be met. I stopped checking my phone hopefully after family events, stopped feeling disappointed when I wasn't included in impromptu gatherings, stopped measuring my worth by how much attention I got from people who had never really seen me anyway. But the loneliness was crushing. I'd go weeks without meaningful human contact, speaking only to coworkers and service workers. Weekends stretched endlessly, filled with solo activities and one-sided phone calls with distant friends who were too busy with their own lives to really connect. I started wondering if my brother had been right all along. Maybe I really was just a shadow, neither alive nor needed. Update 1. The day everything changed started like any other. I was at my parents' house fixing their back door, which had been sticking for months. It was one of those small tasks that I'd volunteered for, partly because I genuinely wanted to help and partly because it gave me a reason to be there without having to navigate awkward family conversations. My brother and his wife had stopped by with their son, now 4 years old and more energetic than ever. The adults were sitting on the back patio, drinking coffee and discussing some work drama that I wasn't really following. I was focused on the door, trying to figure out why the frame had warped, when I heard my brother launch into another one of his casual put-downs. He was telling some story about a coworker who reminded him of me, describing this person as completely competent but somehow forgettable, the kind of person who does their job but never stands out in any meaningful way. Everyone laughed, and I felt that familiar burn of embarrassment mixed with resignation. This was just who he was, who we were together, and nothing was going to change that. I was so absorbed in my own feelings that I almost missed the sound. It was subtle at first, just a little scraping noise that could have been anything. But something about it made me look up from the door, and that's when I saw him. The kid had somehow gotten himself onto the patio railing. Not just sitting on it, but standing, his little hands gripping the top rail while his feet balanced precariously on the narrow ledge. We were on the 3rd floor, and below was nothing but concrete patio and landscaping rocks. Time did that thing where it simultaneously slows down and speeds up. I could see everything with perfect clarity, the way his small body swayed slightly in the breeze, how his hands were positioned exactly wrong for maintaining balance. The look of pure adventure on his face as he gazed down at what must have seemed like an exciting drop to his 4-year-old brain. The adults were still talking, completely oblivious. They were sitting at an angle where the kid was partially blocked from their view by a patio umbrella. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the knowledge that by the time I got their attention and they processed what was happening, it would be too late. Maybe it was just instinct. Instead, I dropped the screwdriver I was holding and ran. I didn't think about the distance, didn't calculate angles or consider consequences. I just moved, covering the space between the door and the railing faster than I'd ever moved in my life. The kid saw me coming and turned slightly, which made him wobble dangerously. I could see him starting to lose his balance, his small body beginning to tip forward. I launched myself at the railing, reaching out to grab him just as he started to fall. My hands connected with his waist, and for a moment we were both suspended there, me hanging over the railing with my feet barely touching the patio floor, him dangling in the air above a 30-foot drop. The physics of the situation caught up quickly. I had his weight pulling me forward, and nothing to brace against. We were both going over. The fall felt like it lasted forever and no time at all. I managed to twist my body so that I'd hit the ground first, keeping him on top of me. The impact was devastating. I felt my arm snap on contact with the concrete, heard the bone break with a sound that was both crack and crunch. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from my wrist up through my shoulder and into my chest. But he was okay. Scared and crying, but okay. He'd landed on me instead of the concrete, and aside from some scrapes and bruises, he was unharmed. I rolled him off me and tried to sit up, which was when I realized just how badly I'd been hurt. The chaos that followed was a blur of sirens and shouting and medical questions I couldn't really process through the pain. The paramedics had to give me something for the pain before they could even examine my arm properly. I remember snippets, the kid crying for his dad, my brother's face white with shock, my parents arriving at the hospital looking completely shaken. The x-rays showed that I'd broken both bones in my forearm, plus cracked a rib and given myself a concussion. The orthopedic surgeon explained that it was going to require surgery to repair, that I'd be in a cast for months, that there might be permanent limitations to my range of motion. I nodded along, still feeling detached from the whole situation. What I remember most clearly from those first few hours wasn't the pain or the medical procedures. It was the way everyone kept looking at me differently. Like they were seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, and not quite knowing what to make of what they found. My brother stayed at the hospital the entire time I was in surgery. When I woke up in recovery, he was sitting in the chair next to my bed, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years. His usual confident demeanor was completely gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before, vulnerability. He didn't say much at first, just sat there while I came fully back to consciousness, helped me figure out how to use the bed controls with my good arm, brought me water when I was thirsty. It was the most attentive I'd ever seen him be with anyone, let alone me. The kid was fine, which everyone kept reassuring me about. He'd been checked out thoroughly and released with nothing more than some minor scrapes. But the psychological impact on the family was significant. Everyone kept talking about what could have happened, about how close we'd come to losing him, about how differently things could have turned out. I spent 3 days in the hospital, partly for observation because of the concussion and partly because the surgery had been more complicated than expected. During that time, I had a steady stream of visitors, which was unprecedented in my adult life. My parents came every day, bringing food and magazines and an awkward but genuine concern I hadn't experienced from them in years. But it was my brother's behavior that really threw me off balance. He was there constantly, handling logistics with the hospital, coordinating with my insurance, making sure I understood what the doctors were telling me. He'd taken time off work, which was something he never did, and seemed genuinely distressed about my condition. On the last day, while I was waiting for my discharge paperwork, he finally said what had been building up between us. He told me he'd been thinking about what I'd done, about the split-second decision to risk my own safety for his son. He said he kept playing it over in his mind and couldn't understand how I'd reacted so quickly when he and everyone else had been completely oblivious to the danger. Then he said something that completely blindsided me. He told me he'd been wrong about me, not just that day but for years. He said he'd been so focused on maintaining his position as the successful brother that he'd never really looked at who I actually was. He said watching me throw myself over that railing without hesitation had shown him something about my character that he'd never bothered to notice before. The conversation was awkward and emotional and nothing like any interaction we'd ever had. I didn't know how to respond to this version of my brother, this person who seemed genuinely remorseful and uncertain. Part of me wanted to embrace this change, but a bigger part was suspicious. I'd been disappointed by him too many times to trust that this wasn't just temporary guilt that would fade once the crisis was over. Update 2. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced in my adult relationship with my family. My brother started calling me regularly, not just to check on my recovery, but to actually talk. Real conversations about work, about life, about things that mattered to both of us. It was strange and uncomfortable at first, like learning to speak a new language with someone I'd known my entire life. He also started including me in family activities in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory. When they planned weekend outings, I'd get a real invitation instead of the usual afterthought text. When he and his wife had people over for dinner, My name was on the guest list from the beginning rather than added at the last minute if they needed an extra body. The kid, meanwhile, had developed what his parents called hero worship for me. Every time I saw him, he'd want to examine my cast and hear the story of how I'd saved him. He'd drawn pictures of the two of us flying through the air, which his parents had hung on their refrigerator right next to his other artwork. For the first time in my life, I was someone's favorite person, and it was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. But the most significant change was in how my parents treated me. They started asking for my opinion on family decisions, including me in conversations in a way they never had before. My mother called me one evening just to talk, no specific agenda, and we ended up chatting for over an hour about everything and nothing. It was the kind of casual, comfortable conversation I'd watched her have with my brother countless times but had never experienced myself. The attention was overwhelming. After years of being invisible, suddenly being seen felt almost as uncomfortable as being ignored. I found myself questioning everyone's motives, wondering if this new treatment was genuine or just guilt-driven pity that would fade once the drama of the accident wore off. My recovery was slow and frustrating. The cast made everything difficult, from basic daily tasks to sleeping comfortably. I had to take time off work, which put me behind on projects and created financial stress I hadn't anticipated. Physical therapy was painful and tedious, and the doctors kept warning me that I might never regain full strength and mobility in my arm. But the hardest part wasn't physical. It was navigating this new family dynamic while dealing with my own complicated feelings about what had happened. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, not the heroic version everyone else seemed to see, but the terrifying reality of those few seconds when I thought we were both going to die. I started having nightmares about falling, about not being fast enough, about arriving at the hospital to find out the kid hadn't made it. I'd wake up in cold sweats, checking my phone to make sure there were no emergency calls from my brother. The what-ifs haunted me in a way that the actual injuries didn't. My brother seemed to sense my internal struggle, even though I tried to hide it. One evening, about 6 weeks after the accident, he came over to my apartment unannounced. He brought dinner and beer, and we sat on my couch eating takeout while he tried to convince me to talk about what I was going through. I finally broke down and told him about the nightmares, about the constant anxiety that something would happen to his son when I wasn't around to prevent it. I told him how scared I'd been in those moments when we were falling, how I'd been certain we were both going to die, how I couldn't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. He listened without interrupting, without trying to minimize what I was feeling or rush to make me feel better. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I'd never known. He'd been having his own nightmares since the accident, dreams where he watched his son fall and couldn't reach him in time, where he had to live with the knowledge that his child had died while he was sitting 10 feet away, completely unaware of the danger. He said the guilt was eating him alive, not just about what had almost happened, but about how he'd treated me over the years. He said he'd spent his whole life defining himself in opposition to me, building his identity around being everything I wasn't. He convinced himself that putting me down was just harmless sibling rivalry, never really considering how it affected me or what kind of person it made him. The conversation lasted until well past midnight, and by the end of it, we were both emotionally exhausted. But something had shifted between us, something fundamental that went beyond guilt or gratitude. For the first time in our adult lives, we'd actually seen each other as complete human beings rather than the roles we'd been playing for so long. That night marked the beginning of a different kind of relationship between us. It wasn't instantly perfect, and there were still moments of awkwardness as we figured out how to interact without the old patterns of dominance and dismissal. But there was a foundation of genuine respect that had never existed before. The kid's birthday party a few months later was a turning point for the whole family. In previous years, I'd been the uncle who showed up with a gift and sat quietly in the corner, while everyone else participated in the celebration. This year, I was actively involved in planning the party, helping to decorate, being asked to take pictures of important moments. But the most meaningful part was when the kid insisted that I help him blow out his candles. He grabbed my good hand and pulled me over to stand next to him while everyone sang happy birthday. When it came time to make a wish and blow out the candles, he whispered to me that he was wishing for my arm to get all the way better so we could go on more adventures together. Standing there next to him, surrounded by family members who were actually glad I was there, I felt something I'd never experienced before. I belonged. Not as an obligation or an afterthought, but as someone who mattered, whose presence added something valuable to the family dynamic. My brother caught my eye from across the room during the cake cutting and smiled at me, a real smile without any underlying tension or competition. Later, as we were cleaning up, he told me he'd been thinking about what the kid had said about adventures, and he wanted to plan a family camping trip for all of us. He said he thought it would be good for his son to have more memories of time spent with his uncle, and he wanted to be part of creating those memories rather than preventing them. The invitation meant more to me than any apology or explanation could have. It was proof that this change in our relationship wasn't just temporary guilt, but a genuine shift in how he saw me and my place in the family. Final update. The camping trip happened 6 months later, after my cast was finally off and I'd regained most of the mobility in my arm. It was my first time being included in a family vacation as an actual participant rather than a tag-along, and I didn't know what to expect. We rented a cabin in the mountains, and for 3 days, I got to experience what it felt like to be part of a family that actually enjoyed each other's company. My brother and I took his son hiking, taught him to skip rocks in the lake, stayed up late around the campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But the most significant moment came on the second night, after the kid had gone to bed and we were sitting by the fire. My brother started talking about his fears as a parent, about how the accident had made him realize how quickly everything could change, how many dangers he couldn't protect his son from. He said that watching me risk my life without hesitation had made him understand something important about love and sacrifice. He said he'd spent so many years focused on being successful and impressive that he'd never really thought about what it meant to be truly present for the people who mattered to him. Then he said something that completely changed how I understood our entire relationship. He told me he'd always been jealous of me, which was so shocking that I actually laughed out loud. He explained that while he'd been busy performing for everyone else, I'd always been genuine, that I'd never needed external validation to know who I was. He said he built his whole identity around being better than me, but that the accident had shown him that when it really mattered, I was the one who acted with courage and selflessness while he sat oblivious to his own child's danger. He said he'd spent his life trying to prove he was superior to someone who had always been better than him in the ways that actually counted. I didn't know how to respond to that. For so long, I'd accepted his version of our relationship, his characterization of me as the lesser brother, the family disappointment. Hearing him say that he'd been wrong, not just about that day but about everything, felt like someone had rewritten the story of my entire life. We talked until the fire burned down to embers, really talked in a way we'd never done before. He asked me about my childhood, about how his treatment had affected me, about what I'd needed from the family that I'd never gotten. I found myself telling him things I'd never said out loud, about the loneliness, about feeling invisible, about learning to expect nothing so I wouldn't be disappointed. He cried, which was something I'd never seen him do. He apologized, not just for that day or that year, but for decades of dismissal and cruelty. He said he wished he could go back and be the brother I deserved, but since he couldn't, he wanted to try to be that person going forward. The conversation was healing in a way I hadn't expected. Not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. For the first time, someone in my family had really seen the impact of how I'd been treated and taken responsibility for their part in it. When we got back from the trip, things continued to evolve. My brother started making a point of celebrating my achievements, small as they were. When I got a promotion at work, he took me out to dinner and made a toast. When I finished a challenging project, he called to congratulate me. He was actively working to build me up in the same way he'd spent years tearing me down. My parents, perhaps influenced by his changed attitude, began treating me differently too. They started asking about my life with genuine interest, including me in family decisions, seeking my advice on things that mattered. For my birthday that year, they threw me a party, a real party with decorations and a cake and relatives I hadn't seen in years. It was the first time I'd ever been the center of positive attention at a family gathering. The kid, now 5, had fully recovered from the accident with no lasting physical or emotional trauma. But our relationship had been permanently changed by what we'd been through together. He still called me his hero, which embarrassed and delighted me in equal measure. He'd started asking his parents if I could come to his school events, wanting to show me off to his friends and teachers. One day, he drew a picture of our family and hung it on the refrigerator. In it, everyone was standing together in a line, holding hands. But I wasn't at the end or off to the side like I'd always imagined myself. I was right in the middle, an integral part of the group, drawn the same size as everyone else with the same happy smile. Looking at that picture, I realized that somewhere in the process of healing from the accident and rebuilding my relationship with my brother, I'd stopped seeing myself as the family disappointment. I'd started to understand that my worth wasn't determined by how much attention I got or how successful I appeared to be. I had value simply by being who I was, and the people who mattered had finally started to see it too. The physical scars from the accident eventually faded, but the emotional transformation was permanent. I'd spent my whole life believing I was invisible, unnecessary, a burden on people who would be happier without me. But in the moment when it mattered most, when a child's life was in danger, I'd been the one who acted. I'd been the one who was present, aware, and willing to sacrifice everything for someone else's safety. That realization changed everything, not just about how my family saw me, but about how I saw myself. I wasn't the shadow my brother had made me believe I was. I was a person capable of love, courage, and heroism when the situation demanded it. I was someone worth knowing, worth including, worth celebrating. My brother and I will never have the easy, natural relationship that some siblings enjoy. Too much happened between us for that to be possible. But we have something perhaps more valuable, a relationship built on mutual respect, genuine understanding, and shared commitment to being better than we were before. Sometimes I think about that moment on the railing, about the split second when I had to choose between my own safety and a child's life. I didn't hesitate then, and I wouldn't hesitate now. Not because I'm particularly brave or noble, but because that's what love looks like when it's tested. That's what family means when it's real. I'm not invisible anymore. I'm not a shadow or a disappointment or deadweight. I'm a son, a brother, an uncle, and a man who knows his own worth. It took 35 years and a broken arm to get here, but I finally understand that I was never the problem. I was just a person waiting for someone to really see me. And now they do.